Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. The place was called the Harlow House, and even the rental agreement seemed to be written on paper that predated color photography. It sat just outside of Northampton, Massachusetts, off a winding state road, nestled deep enough in the woods that the afternoon sun barely skimmed the clapboard siding. I was looking for solitude, silence, and ideally, cheap rent. As a freelance copywriter, a polite term for professional recluse, I chased the low cost of living, not the vibrant city life I'd left behind in Boston. This ramshackle 3-bedroom house, built circa 1888, ticked all 3 boxes with a heavy, dust-caked checkmark. My prospective landlord, a man named Mr. Finch who spoke with the quiet, measured cadence of someone who'd seen a lot and regretted most of it, stood on the porch, nervously kicking at a loose piece of slate. The air that late October evening had that classic, brittle New England chill that sinks into your bones regardless of how thick your coat is. "It rents cheap because it needs work," Mr. Finch had mumbled, holding the keychain as if it might bite him. "Structurally sound, though. It's got history. I like old houses," I told him, trying to sound breezy. "Rustic is fine by me. I'm thinking atmosphere." He didn't laugh. He just gave me this thin, unsettling look, the kind of look that said, "You think you know what atmosphere is, kid," and handed over the keys. "Don't go into the cellar after dark if you can help it. Heating system's down there, and the crawl space isn't tidy." I dismissed it the second he drove away. Old guys say weird things. Old houses in New England usually have cellars that look like sets from a B-grade horror movie, full of spiders, ancient tools, and general rot. Moving in was a slow, solitary affair. My possessions consisted mainly of books, mismatched furniture salvaged from my old apartment, and the 2 things I truly cared about, my high-end workstation and the enormous, temperamental espresso machine, both of which I promptly set up in the enclosed sun porch, which would serve as my office. The first week was dedicated to uncovering the house's secrets. The electrical wiring was a chaotic tapestry of old and new. The plumbing made sounds like a crack in gargling gravel. And yes, every midnight, the shifting temperatures combined with the 130-year-old wood to create a symphony of creaks, groans, and sometimes what sounded exactly like solid objects dropping onto the hardwood floor, only to find nothing in the morning. I settled into a routine. Right from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., run or hike the dark trails nearby before dusk, and then settle in for a night of reading or binge watching, always with the espresso machine murmuring in the corner. The house was enormous for one person, probably close to 2,500 square feet, but the lack of immediate neighbors, save for the tall, whispering pines, was exactly what I wanted. It felt like living inside a deeply satisfying silence. The atmosphere was there, though not the cozy one I'd intended. It was a dense, almost liquid stillness that sometimes felt less like a lack of sound and more like a muted roar. The entire house seemed to retain the smell of 19th century coal dust, wet plaster, and something vaguely metallic. The first thing I couldn't explain, the explainable but weird event, happened on the 10th night. I had been working past midnight, fully immersed in a project deadline. My office, the sun porch, was connected by a short hallway to the kitchen. I shut down the computer, went into the kitchen for that pre-bed glass of water, and flipped off the overhead light. As I did so, I glanced at the long, dark hallway leading back toward the living room and the front staircase. And I saw the curtain move. It wasn't a billowy movement. There was no open window. It was a single, precise slide. The heavy, beige drape covering the living room window, one that hadn't been touched in the 10 days since I moved the furniture in, slid from left to right about 6 inches, just enough to open a thin, pale strip to the darkness outside. I froze, water glass halfway to my mouth, and waited for the sound of air conditioning or furnace kick in. Nothing. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip coming from the kitchen sink. I was alone, and every window in the house was sealed because of the cold. Also, the only physical way a curtain could slide like that would be if someone had manually dragged the draw cord that hung down beside the frame. Wind pressure. I muttered, but it sounded ridiculous. I walked down the hall, my own shadow stretching and warping as I neared the living room. I reached for the curtain, but hesitated. The hair literally stood up on the back of my neck. I yanked it fully closed. The sound of the runner rings grinding on the metal rod was startlingly loud, and firmly set the curtain stop clips I'd installed days ago to prevent the exact flapping and non-existent draft movement I'd rationalized. On the way back to the bedroom, I checked the front door lock 3 times. Just the house settling, I told myself as I got into bed, the cold New England air permeating the threadbare sheets. It's an old house. Old houses are weird. But there was a subtle knot of anxiety in my stomach that stayed with me until I finally managed to fall asleep hours later. It was a house that was now telling me it was not empty. The small, explainable anomalies continued, though they were always so fleeting that I consistently managed to push them into the category of tired eyes or lack of coffee. The bedroom door, which I kept ajar for the circulation, was sometimes found fully shut in the morning. My phone charger, resting on the bedside table, would occasionally be found plugged into the low wall socket, cable coiled neatly beside it, even though I swore I had unplugged it and left it draped loose on the dresser when I went to sleep. It was annoying, mildly spooky, but not alarming. It felt like a mildly mischievous resident, perhaps bored but harmless. I started calling it the landlord, referencing Mr. Finch's unease. It was a joke to keep my sanity intact. The escalation began with the radio. I always had NPR on softly in the kitchen during my writing breaks. I had a small, antique analog radio sitting atop the refrigerator, perfectly tuned. On a particular Friday morning, I brewed a cup of coffee, turned on the light, and flipped the radio on. It wasn't NPR. It was static, just a hissing avalanche of white noise. I reached up and adjusted the dial, which was sitting squarely on the NPR marker, yet it was full static. I turned the dial slightly, found the clean, clear public radio broadcast, and walked back to my office. 15 minutes later, I returned for a refill. The hissing static was back. The dial was perfectly centered on the clear station, precisely where I had left it. I adjusted the dial, listening for the clear broadcast, found it, and marked my frustration up to a faulty speaker. The old thing was bound to be temperamental. But it got worse the following morning. The hiss was there, but it wasn't static. It was something rhythmic, like an almost subsonic thumping that only manifested when the radio was on the NPR band. As I cautiously moved the dial away from the center, the broadcast came on clean and clear. Yet when I moved it back to NPR, the one and only frequency I listened to, the thumping and white noise returned. It felt oddly purposeful. It felt targeted. Later that same day, I set the radio to an actual music station, far down the dial, one I never listened to. I left the house for a long outdoor run, about 2 hours. When I came back, the faint strains of classical music drifted out of the kitchen. I hung up my wet running clothes and peeked in. The radio was on, but it was no longer on the music station. It was sitting exactly on the NPR band, silent, except for the same maddening hiss, the low, steady thumping, and nothing else. It was no longer a faulty wire or drafts. Something was deliberately trying to take away the single auditory reassurance I had in this house. The silence, which had once been so appealing, was beginning to feel hostile. I put the radio in the hall closet, deciding I would only listen to podcasts with headphones, to stop giving it what it seemed to want. That night, everything changed. The mischievous annoyance morphed into something cold, tangible, and definitely malicious. I had cooked dinner, a sloppy spaghetti carbonara, and was sitting at the worn wooden table in the expansive dining room, scrolling aimlessly on my tablet. The room was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging over the table and the weak LED glow from my screen. It was just after 8 p.m. when I heard the kitchen cabinets start to open. I didn't hear a bang or a scrape, as if from a faulty spring. I heard the clear, deliberate sliding sound of a cabinet knob being turned, followed by a slight, metallic click, and the sound of thin wood on wood as the cupboard slowly opened, a smooth, patient action that felt utterly mechanical and human at the same time. I dropped my fork and didn't breathe. The sound came from the opposite end of the kitchen, maybe 20 feet away, around the corner of the pantry wall. I sat motionless, listening through the low hum of the refrigerator. Clack. Another cabinet door, then another, opening with the same slow, deliberate movement. 1, 2, almost like checking things inside. Then I heard the rattle of cutlery. That was too much. The silverware drawer. Someone, or something, was now actively looking at my spoons. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The sound stopped immediately. Abrupt silence. Just the fridge hum and my own rapid, shallow breathing. I grabbed the tablet, flicked it off, and picked up the heavy metal fork, my only weapon. I got up slowly, quietly, edging toward the doorway leading into the kitchen. My whole body felt like it was plugged into a low-level electrical current. I swung around the doorframe and flicked on the single overhead light. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Plates drying on the rack. Sink dripping. Except for one thing. The silverware drawer. The long, horizontal drawer below the countertop was pulled out 2 inches. Just enough to show the metallic glint of the forks and knives within and to prove that my ears hadn't been deceiving me. But the cabinets were closed. The silence of a person, or the sound of an intruder, would have either retreated or attacked. A mischievous ghost would have moved something overtly to mess with me. But this thing had done enough to open the drawer, stopped when I called out, and then closed the other cabinets, as if tidying up before leaving. It was highly ordered, almost passive-aggressive conduct, not playful pranks. I walked a few steps over, heart pounding in my chest and temples. I pushed the silverware drawer closed. It didn't glide smoothly. It met with resistance, and closed with a faint, final clatter as the contents shifted inside. I opened it again. Inside, my few forks and knives were now gathered into a messy, deliberate pile at the very far right-hand corner of the tray, instead of being uniformly distributed across it as I left them a few hours earlier. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, staring at the silverware. It wasn't the sound, or the movement. It was the absolute, clear malice evidenced by the deliberate rearrangement of the cutlery just to let me know, without any possibility of a doubt, that I was not alone and not in control. I slowly backed out of the kitchen, went into the hall, found the heavy-duty deadbolt on the front door, and locked it. Then I walked backward up the vast, echoing staircase to the single locked-door sanctuary I created, the ensuite basement bathroom, the smallest room in the house, and sat on the edge of the tub, fork still in hand, telling myself I was a grown man armed with a piece of metal, hiding from what, exactly? A spirit that liked to clean up after itself but messily? That night, I experienced sound for the first time. Not a creak, not a vibration in the wood, but a sound from the inside out, the low, vibrating hum that started precisely at 3:17 a.m. It wasn't in the walls. It was in the floor, in a concentrated spot right underneath the middle of my bed. It felt less like a mechanical vibration, and more like a massive, trapped bumblebee. My chest rattled rhythmically with the frequency. It was loud enough to be clearly audible, yet low enough not to wake an average sleeper until it shook their ribcage. I climbed out of bed, hands clutching my acoustic guitar case, which was the final weapon I was willing to settle for. I stood on the bare floor beside the bed. The humming was deafening and felt as if a colossal subwoofer was buried in the dirt below the house's foundation. I pressed my ear to the floorboards. The hum intensified violently, as if whatever was vibrating had noticed the attention it was gathering. My resolve crumbled. I scrambled for my jeans and a t-shirt, abandoned my watch and phone, which would mean navigating the dark, cavernous house later for them, and then clattered down the stairs, out the front door, and only stopped running when I was out onto the deserted state road, enveloped by the frigid, oppressive darkness of the New England night. I didn't stop running until I reached Mr. Finch's modest Maine farmhouse, a quarter-mile away, the only landmark in miles. Panting, shivering, and with my bare feet aching on the frost-dusted asphalt, I pounded on his door furiously, screaming his name into the cold, silent woods. I looked back, and on the small hill beneath the ancient oaks, the Harlow house stood dark, unmoving, and utterly silent. Not a flicker of light. Just a perfect, malevolent silhouette against the sickly wash of the half-moon night sky. He seemed less surprised by the frantic hammering on his door at 3:30 a.m. than he was by the fact I was standing on his porch barefoot. Mr. Finch, dressed in a faded flannel robe that clashed terribly with his thick white beard, simply moved aside and let me stumble into his overly warm living room. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and stale coffee. The house, I managed to wheeze out, my lungs burning from the dash in the icy air. Something is in the house. The humming, the drawers, everything. He stared at me the way an old country doctor assesses a hysterical patient, sadly, dismissively. Harlow House, he murmured, rubbing his chin. It wasn't a question. Said you liked atmosphere, didn't you, son? He sat me down, handed me a scratchy wool blanket, and poured me a tumbler of warm water from one of the kerosene heaters. He wasn't skeptical, he was resigned. This was what Old Man Harlow's house did, and nothing any of its temporary residents experienced would change that. It's not just drafts, Mr. Finch. I heard the cutlery drawer, I whispered, the absurdity of the details still hanging thick in the air. I felt vibrations under my bed that made my body shake. Finch sighed, settling into his rocking chair, which immediately began to creak, a sound entirely different, and far more mundane, than the house I had just fled. Yeah, that's what he does. The cutlery, the small things getting moved. The noise. I had a fella tried to renovate the kitchen almost 40 years ago. Said the same things. Tried to argue the electrical box was possessed when the foreman found every wire connector cut clean where the lines ran behind the drywall. Possessed? I repeated, wrapping the blanket impossibly tighter around my shoulders. Who is he? Old Man Harlow. Elijah. Finch's eyes settled on the dark, misty window. Died in that house. Died cold and alone, waiting for a doctor who never made it up this far from the town center. His son, the idiot who eventually sold me the property, found him in the front guest bedroom. Frozen, supposedly. People always said he was mean, though. Not aggressive, not volatile. Just flat out, quiet, petty mean. Like tearing a spider web down with a twig, just because he could. Finch paused, letting the implication hang. The house isn't haunted by a demon or a crying ghost, son. It's haunted by a passive-aggressive jerk. I didn't find dark solace in that morbid assessment, but I did find a narrative. If Old Man Harlow was deliberately mean and petty, setting his spectral aim only at minor annoyances, the radio, the neat drawers, the humming aimed to disrupt sleep, perhaps that was its extent. It was unsettling, infuriating, but not physically threatening. Yet, I spent the rest of the cold morning on Finch's couch. He lent me a pair of thick socks. And we talked a bit about the history of the house, stopping just short of actually suggesting any kind of solution. The sun was well up, painting the frost outside a brilliant, icy blue, before I felt strong enough to step back into the dark woods and confront the house that had kicked me out. I walked back slowly, taking the time to observe the house in the harsh, clarifying morning light. It looked utterly normal, tired, and in dire need of a fresh coat of paint. The windows stared out like opaque, cloudy eyes. My front door was still standing slightly ajar, just as I'd left it in my panic. The chain lock, which I had clearly fumbled to yank on the bolt, was now neatly hanging in its correct receptacle, the slider perfectly inserted into the dead latch holder. But the most alarming sight was about 3 feet from the front porch. Near a cluster of dead ferns, my wristwatch lay face up on the grass. It was my good watch, and I knew I had ditched it beside my bed, maybe even under the bed, in the bedroom on the second floor. It was a precise, clear confirmation that this thing had followed me down the stairs, opened the locked door I swore I locked, or perhaps picked the key out of my pocket, and then deliberately placed the expensive item where I would see it first when I came back from Mr. Finch's property. It had waited, silent and watchful. I stepped over the watch and into the house. The morning sun pouring through the dust motes in the air did little to dispel the dense, frigid temperature inside. I first checked the bedroom upstairs. Empty. Everything was just as I had left it, except the bed, or more accurately, the heavy, antique wooden headboard, had been pulled away from the wall by maybe a full foot. It would take considerable physical effort to move that piece. Then I checked the hallway. There was a fresh scraped mark on the 130-year-old plaster on the south-facing wall, shoulder high. Only a tiny bit of material. But I knew with paralyzing certainty, my acoustic guitar cover, the weapon I intended to use, was no longer propped against the window in my room. A moment later I located it, laid exactly flat in the middle of the hallway like a fallen trophy. That scraped mark meant it had been dragged, maybe tossed, over the mahogany banister. It had moved an instrument of potential defense. The rules were changing. For the rest of the day, I moved my belongings methodically out of the house. I worked with the same efficiency and emotionless energy one reserves for a messy, necessary divorce. I packed books, kitchen implements, even the detested espresso machine, focusing only on the manual labor. All the while, the house was silent. Almost too silent, like a predator who knew its prey was already trapped and focused on escape. By 4 p.m., I was sweating, exhausted, and the rental minivan was half full in the driveway. I needed one last set of items from the downstairs office, my external hard drives, which contained every bite of my working life. The second I opened the office door, the repurposed sun porch, I stopped dead on the threshold. My entire workspace had been meticulously rearranged. My desk pad was gone. The triple monitor setup, while still wired, was now at a weird 30-degree angle to the window. My keyboard and mouse were neatly placed, as if waiting for their next use. It was tidy, but fundamentally wrong, violating the order I had struggled for a week to establish. Then I lowered my gaze toward the carpet beside the desk. My hard drive sat in a shallow pool of water. The hard drive enclosure, sleek and shiny, was in about an inch of water, soaking from a slow leak from a small, clear glass tumbler that was now tipped over next to it. It hadn't been an accidental spill. The tumbler usually was nowhere near the equipment. It had been moved from the kitchen, placed next to the electronics, filled just enough with water, and then slowly tilted in the perfect spot to cause maximum damage. The data, all of it, all my work lost. Completely ruined with a move so subtle, so coldly malicious, it was the single meanest, most personalized attack I'd experienced. It wasn't just physical disruption, it was professional sabotage. Rage, pure and blinding, washed over the fear that had kept me subdued since 3 a.m. Elijah Harlow, the miserable, petty owner, had attacked the core of my stability. I screamed. It wasn't a call for help, but an explosion of raw, impotent fury. "You miserable son of a BTCH! Are you done? Is that all you've got? You think you can?" That was when the slam happened against the doorframe, interrupting my pathetic roar. It was neither a draft nor an impact from a falling object. It was a clear, sudden, violently kinetic thump on the left side of the metal frame of the doorway leading into the office. The cheap magnetic holder for my door-jammed notebook, resting lightly on the wall beside the frame, fell down. That was all. Just the impact on the metal, the notebook's clatter, and the sudden silence. But it was close. Too close. It was right next to me, just outside my current field of vision, in the shadowy corner of the hallway connecting the porch office to the kitchen. And it wasn't passive-aggressive anymore. It was challenging me. It was there. I backed up slowly into the office, my mind screaming just one word: retreat. This thing was adapting. It had progressed from petty annoyance to mild threat, radio interference, to unsettling surveillance, watch on the lawn, to sabotage, hard drives, and now, physical manifestation capable of moving items right next to me. I decided not to grab the equipment, not to even attempt to save the water-soaked remains of my livelihood because the price of a second more in that house was now too high. I walked stiffly, forcing myself not to run, out of the office through the kitchen, ignoring the drawer of forks. I did not look behind me, didn't check the rearview in the minivan's side mirror. I got into the dry rental van and started the engine. I paused one last time, my key twisting in the ignition. I sat there for a long time, the engine humming softly, staring at the dark window of the master bedroom. I could feel the icy, hateful presence watching me from inside the structure, a distinct, cold stare that seemed to pierce the distance between its 130-year-old plaster and the safety of my modern vehicle. The air felt heavy, like it was resisting my exit. "Keep your SH hole," I whispered to the house, putting the van into reverse. As the van rolled slowly backward down the gravel driveway and onto the state road, I heard a terrific, echoing crash come from the house. It was the sound of something large, complex, and filled with glass. I instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror. One of the full-pane, floor-to-ceiling windows on the west side of the sun porch office stood starkly empty, the glass having apparently shattered inward onto the floor against my former desk setup. I floored the gas pedal and left, hearing the muffled chime of broken glass still settling on the porch. That was my eviction papers, delivered, sealed, and smashed. I drove directly to Mr. Finch's house, and found him outside setting his massive, scowling black hound out on its leash for the late evening stroll. I handed him the brass key ring in utter silence, my hands still shaking too violently to speak. He looked at the keys, then at the expression of absolute, defeated terror etched onto my face. He didn't ask about the window. He didn't ask what happened. He simply nodded and tucked the keys immediately inside the deep pockets of his denim jacket, looking as if the transaction had been precisely what he'd expected the moment I'd signed the lease. "Bad one?" he asked finally, his hand stroking the neck of the black dog. He ruined my work. My computer backups. I managed. The meanness. It wasn't an accident. He stopped petting the dog and walked slowly to my driver's side open window, his face grim in the twilight. "Like I said, son, Elijah Harlow was a jerk in life, and that kind of pettiness doesn't burn cleanly away, even after death. He'll find whatever you care about most, and he'll scratch at it." Finch put his hand on my shoulder, a surprisingly heavy, calming presence. "Go get some dry socks, some coffee, and get far away from him. It's the only way to win with that kind." And I did. I drove south that night, only stopping in Pennsylvania to replace the soaked hard drives I'd left behind, those silent sacrifices on the altar of the old man's malice. I never again felt comfortable in a house built before the 1950s. The low, deliberate thumping sound, meant to disrupt sleep and focus beneath the center of my bed, has faded in memory. But the cold weight of the knowledge that a pure, personal hate can carry on without a body still hangs in the corners of my apartment on every quiet, lonely night. Whenever I have an absolute surge of anger or stress, I subconsciously check my surroundings to ensure no cup of water is resting too closely to something vital. Harlow House is still out there, sitting quietly in the cold New England woods, waiting for its next sensitive, detail-oriented recluse to move in, so old Elijah can continue his quiet, deeply spiteful work. What it wants? Silence, total disruption of whoever is inside, and the cold satisfaction of ruining the things essential to others. And it has all the time in the world to be the meanest resident you could ever have. Story 2. My name is Travis, and for 8 years I was swallowed whole by the solitude of the Redwood National Park in Northern California. The redwoods, they are not just trees. They are living cathedrals dating back centuries, things that predate colonial history, things that simply tower over your pitiful concept of time and scale. When you work deep inside them, as a patrolling ranger, you quickly realize you're not managing a parcel of land. You're just a speck of warm flesh moving beneath titans. Life there is less about hiking trails and more about routine, silence, and the profound, oppressive cold of perpetual shadow. And in that kind of silence you hear things. things you shouldn't. My sector was a huge, undeveloped wedge in the southwest corner of the park, bordering some rough, private timberland. It was notorious for its remoteness. On a good day, I was 2 hours away from the nearest faint cell phone signal, 4 hours from civilization, and maybe 20 feet from a vertical drop. My duties ranged from checking on old research markers to maintaining boundary wires that kept the logging companies out. The real purpose, though, was simply to be there, a witness, a deterrent, an official presence in what was essentially wilderness in its ancient, terrible glory. There's an accepted, unwritten code among rangers in those deep sections, something whispered around the smoky campfires at the seasonal headquarters. You accept the noises you can't fully explain. You learn to live with the shifting ground making sounds like heavy footsteps, the wind through the high canopy sounding like a screaming woman, and the night hunting calls that mimic the sounds of lost children. You attribute it to wind shear, geological settling, or just the weird acoustics of a dense forest where the smallest sound can travel for miles. You have to believe that, or you turn around and drive all the way back to the comfortable fraud of the city. The first few seasons for me were uneventful, pleasantly lonely. I settled into a pattern of silent patrolling. My only true companion was my aged, heavy-duty pickup, Old Bess, and the radio mic hanging down from the dashboard, which, more often than not, just spat static. Then came the fog. The coast fog is always bad, but this was different. This October fog settled inland deeper than I'd ever seen it, a thick, smothering presence that reduced visibility from acres to mere yards. It was a dense, white silence, and it stayed for 5 days straight, chilling the world beneath the redwoods to a suffocating level of damp cold. During this time, the forest didn't just feel lonely, it felt abandoned. It was on the third day of that fog that I got my first true anomaly. I was on a rare night patrol, checking a sensitive section of wire fencing that a crew was scheduled to look at in the morning, and the fog, illuminated by my weak headlamp, looked like dense, swirling flour. Old Bess was creeping down an almost non-existent deer trail when I heard it for the first time, a perfect, clear as a bell imitation of laughter. I slammed on the brakes, causing the back of the pickup to skid only slightly on the wet leaf litter. The sound wasn't cackling or insane. It was 2 or maybe 3 people, specifically one adult and one child's laugh, loud and joyous, receding into the darkness on my left, the side facing the steepest, most overgrown section of the woods. I killed the engine and the lights. My heart almost hammered the emergency brake control off the dashboard. Nobody came out here. Not tourists, not even the illegal marijuana growers. The area was too remote and too brutal. I rolled down my window, straining to listen. It was gone now, replaced by the crushing silence of the fog. I put the truck in park, grabbed my heavy flashlight, and climbed out, placing one boot on the slippery dirt. "Hello?" I yelled. Sound only got swallowed by the thick blanket of moisture. Still nothing. I pulled out my radio mic, adjusted the frequency, and gave the area call. The central communications tower in Shelter Cove was maybe an hour away, clear with me during good weather. "Control, this is Ranger Sierra 37. I am making an unscheduled stop 118 Papa 2. I just heard voices. Possible lost hikers. Requesting check on any recent overdue persons report. The response was a frustrating mash of static, followed by a faint, tinny voice saying, 37. Repeat. Say again? Can't read you. The fog was scattering my signal. As I listened, trying to make out the controller's garbled reply, I heard the sound again, this time much closer, and coming from a different direction, the far right, behind a massive, moss-covered log. It was a woman's cry. Not a scream, but a drawn-out, plaintive whimper of absolute despair. The kind of sound that cuts through all intellectual pretense and screams vulnerability straight into your adrenal gland. It was a direct line of sight away, maybe 30 feet from the truck's fender, deep inside the woods. My training kicked in. Lost person. Disoriented. Injury. Focus. I ditched the radio, grabbed my standard-issue medical bag, and plunged 3 quick blasts on my air horn, the agreed-upon signal for "I am searching for you in this sector." I'm coming in, I bellowed. Stay right there. I pushed past the damp ferns, angling my powerful, rechargeable halogen spotlight into the black undergrowth. The whimper came again, sounding weak and terrified. I knew the moment I heard it that it would be a hiker who had been disoriented by the fog's complete sensory deprivation. They'd been sitting down, maybe hypothermic, just waiting for the world to stop. Flashlight on the ground, shining a path, I kept moving, calling out gently. Ranger here. I'm here to help, just stay in your spot. I moved maybe 40 paces, crossing the dry creek bed and moving around a fallen giant, and called out again. But this time, the sound was coming from behind me. I spun around so fast my feet nearly slid out from under me. The whimper was now a short, breathy, terrified sob that sounded like it was coming from inside my truck cab. I could practically see the sound, like a heat haze plume, directly behind where I had parked Old Bess. I checked the ground in front of me again, where the initial sound had called me. Nothing. No broken branches, no displaced leaves. Nothing that suggested a person was there. The sound had somehow leapfrogged me, moving silently and instantly from deep inside the woods to the inside of my vehicle almost instantaneously during my focus on moving through the brush. I dropped my bag, ran back to the truck and flung the passenger door open, shining the powerful light on the immaculate, empty passenger seat and dashboard. Nothing. Silence. I stood there, panting in the freezing mist, the adrenaline making my extremities tingle uncontrollably. I knew, with the kind of primal certainty only realized when you're truly alone, that no person had made that sound. A person can't traverse 60 feet of deep brush like that. The sobbing, the whimper, it felt like bait designed purely to draw me away from safety. My truck, my radio, my supplies. I retrieved my medical bag and did something highly unusual. I locked the driver and passenger doors of Old Bess, something I never, ever did when patrolling. I decided to walk the wire fence perimeter for another hour, finishing my patrol as if nothing had happened, focusing simply on the dirt under my feet. For the next 4 hours, nothing. Except for the profound, oppressive weight of the surrounding ancient forest, which felt like it was breathing heavily, waiting for me to make another break in my composure. The next documented incident involving the unsettling sounds came 2 weeks later, well out of the foggy season, in an area only known on official maps as the Southwestern Scar, a region devastated by a lightning fire in the 1950s, so regrowth was thick, tangled, and nearly impenetrable. I was inspecting a ridge line, the silence occasionally broken only by the rasp of a hawk's wings above me. I stopped for a water break, pulling my flask from my tactical pack. And then I heard it, the perfect echo of my partner Ranger Kyle's voice, clear as day, calling my name from about 50 yards above the ridge. Travis? Hey, can you hear me? Down there? Kyle was a good, competent guy I had hiked with dozens of times. Our policy was clear, never be in this sector without precise, mandatory call-in before entering. Kyle was hours away, probably sitting in the central office in his rotation. His voice was perfect, slightly winded but clear, and it sounded exactly like a real person trying to get my attention. Yet I knew. That new feeling washed over me like a sheet of ice. I deliberately did not answer. I slowly lowered myself flat onto the dirt trail, dropped my tactical pack silently, and pulled out my binoculars. My heart hammered into the cold dust. I scanned the ridgeline where the call came from. Nothing. No movement, nothing shifting the low shrubbery, and the dead silence returned. But then the voice came again, this time closer, maybe 30 yards, and it was begging. Travis, man, I'm pinned. I twisted my ankle in the rock pile. I can't move, man. I need the radio access. Don't come up, just get the pack. That did it. That perfect, clinical bait had to have taken time to learn. Kyle's voice on his personal distress frequency was the specific, intimate psychological barrier between a logical ranger saving his partner and a fearful civilian running away. It was preying on my need to follow protocol and save a colleague. I didn't utter a word. I laid my rifle flat on the dirt, picked up a fist-sized pine cone, and threw it with all my might into the woods to my right, creating a distracting thump. The voice, as if momentarily confused, paused. Then it made a sound I will absolutely never forget, a low, wet, almost mechanical gurgling distortion of Kyle's voice, devoid of inflections, whispering so low it sounded close to the ground. "Access the backpack, Travis. I'm right here, please." I didn't hesitate. I snatched my rifle and pack, scrambled down the rest of the narrow, loose ridge trail, traversing it much faster than I normally would have, and only stopped my scrambling run when I was back in Old Bess. I started the engine, threw the keys in the igniting fast, and punched it down the trail like a thief who just robbed a bank. I did not look in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't escape the image of something massive, inhuman, but profoundly intelligent standing on the ridge and learning the inflection of my voice. When I reached the lower sector boundary wire a cold hour later, with the engine finally off and the truck safely parked, I felt the immediate, desperate need for information. I cranked the radio to the central office with maximum boost and got control. Finally, a relatively clear signal. "Control, this is 37. Requesting Code 9 verification. What is Ranger Kyle's Sierra 38 stated location? Confirm his assignment now." The female operator's voice was calm, almost irritated by my urgency. 37, S38 is in Sector Alpha 6, processing paperwork. Just checked in 15 minutes ago. Why? You need support, 37? Negative, Control. Stand by, no support needed. I put the mic back in the cradle with shaking hands. He had been 30 miles away, safe at the center's desk. This was not a ghost rattling a drawer. This was a sentient entity using the precise vocal profile of a person I needed to trust, leveraging it against my protocol-driven behavior during a vulnerable moment of isolation. Whatever this entity was, it needed me to stop moving, isolate myself, put down my pack, or get out off my established, safe course of action. It wanted to pull me off the grid, into the brush. Did it want to confuse me, play with me, or finally to hurt me? I didn't want to wait around to find out. I finally began to do my own research, quietly, in the Central Archives. Old Ranger logs. Local historical accounts. Anything that could explain the phenomenon of the mimicry. There were sparse, coded references over the generations, but they only existed in marginalized, almost redacted logbooks. The stories were always the same, just the technology changed. In the 1890s, loggers reported perfect imitation of their wives' names being called from the deep woods. In the 1940s, a researcher reported his radio operator hearing what sounded like naval-style code chatter, something only a military man would know, coming from the same deep area. Only to find the receiver off the batteries. The common, almost mythical diagnosis for the deep woods anomaly in this region, amongst the few who dared to speak of it honestly, was the redwood shade. Some believed it was an ancient tribal protector, a stick walker with the shape of a man, that was so old and powerful it had grown a profound cynicism toward humanity's intrusion. Yet others believed it was a demon, a skin taker or a voice eater that fed off our sense of human connection, isolation, or the terror of being alone. Either way, it was a creature that used the primary survival mechanism, cries for help, against those who had isolated themselves the deepest. My final, and most terrifying, encounter didn't involve voices. It occurred a week before I tendered my resignation, 3 weeks after my incident with the bogus call from Kyle. I was in my cabin, a humble, wooden structure just far enough from the park center to feel remote, with a heavy padlock on the door. It was well lit inside with a roaring fire and a radio tuned to static, just as background noise. I felt oddly secure. The warm wood of the cabin, the heavy, thick walls were an excellent barrier to the freezing night. It was finally a place of absolute, definite safety that no thing of the forest could penetrate. Then came the sound on the outer wall near the stone chimney. It was a scratch. Not frantic, like an animal. Just a low, deliberate, long scratch against the thick cedar siding. A movement that implied something of enormous size and length was being dragged slowly down the exterior of the house's wall. It moved so slowly, with such profound, controlled force that dust and small pebbles fell down near my window on the outside. I froze on the single, worn couch, every muscle in my body retracting. I didn't move for 10 full seconds, clutching the rifle I now kept leaning against the mantel. The scratching stopped directly outside my double-paned window, just a faint click of a long fingernail-like projection tapping the damp wood once, waiting. I waited like a frightened mouse, breathlessly, for what could only happen next, the imitation of my name, the imitation of a sound of distress, or perhaps the shattering of the glass. Instead, I heard one single, deliberate statement. It wasn't a human voice at all, but a wet, airy, multitonal sound that seemed to come from something with a mouth that shouldn't open. The sound was a cross between a low, guttural growl and a perfectly enunciated sentence, spoken in a way that sounded exactly like the redwood needles rubbing against themselves in a long, dry, constant breeze. The sentence was simple, brutal, and terrifying in its implication. It was a language I didn't know, yet somehow, I translated in my head with perfect clarity. You are isolated. All else is me. It sounded like the earth itself had spoken, full of mineral grit and the dry rustling of old bark. A deep silence followed. I kept the lights out, sitting rigidly for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breath, didn't dare challenge the truth of the statement. The thing outside knew exactly what I was doing, not just with my hearing, but with my mind, targeting the one, deep thought that keeps all deep woods workers sane. There is some other person out there. After that night, I packed my affairs, cleaned out the ranger's house, and resigned with the vague, believable excuse. It's just time to return to the city. I forfeited my pension money, didn't look back at the giants, and I kept silent about the redwood shade. I now work a 40-hour week in a data entry farm in Oakland. The lights are blindingly bright. The walls are thin, the desks are too close together, and every breath I take is filled with the thick, reassuring exhaust fumes from 8 lanes of California morning traffic. There are human voices everywhere, hundreds of phones ringing, endless rows of cubicles filled with the sound of ordinary people having dull, ordinary, predictable concerns. The sensory overload is almost painful, but I will take the endless, chaotic, urban white noise over the profound, treacherous silence of the redwoods any day of the week. Because in the city, when you hear a cry for help, it's either real, a police siren, or a distraction. It is never targeted to lure you off the map by a creature older than steel or electricity. I'm safe now, in the constant presence of human unpredictability, in the comforting knowledge of a million other souls nearby. Because on the ancient grid of the woods, I already learned the ultimate truth. Isolation is exactly what it wants. Story 3. My name is Father Elias Thorne. I haven't been an ordained priest for 6 years, but the title adheres to me like old, stained oil. People still come. They find me through the networks, the quiet, desperate referrals handed out fearfully on the dark web of the non-secular crisis community. When the polite ghost hunters hit their limit, and parish priests start calling mental health services, then they come to my secluded office in upstate New York. I'm a specialist, not an exorcist, and the specialty is identifying the true source of spiritual erosion, which, in 90% of cases, is just bad electricity, mold, and a terrible divorce. But sometimes the file is different. The file on the Morris family, the Hilltop case, as it's known internally, had that smell. That particular mix of absolute, cold terror, and the nauseating odor of intellectual skepticism that breaks when confronted with the profoundly true. The Morris assignment drew me to a perfectly manufactured suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Hilltop Preserve, the subdivision was called. It featured identical ranch-style homes, manicured lawns, 2 cars in every garage, and a homeowners association whose rules were probably stricter than a monastic order. They were the epitome of the stable, conventional American dream: Dad, Michael, an accountant, Mom, Sarah, a stay-at-home writer, and their 15-year-old daughter, Emily. The entire psychological shield of their comfortable normalcy was rapidly dissolving. My process starts slow. I arrived not in full clerical garb, but in a dull, gray blazer, carrying a briefcase containing 3 voice recorders, a thermal scanner, and an extensive case log. I insisted on 3 things: total honesty, no contact with the local church, and total access to the subject, Emily. When I first met Emily, she was listless, huddled beneath a thick blanket on the living room couch, staring with utterly detached boredom at a daytime talk show. She didn't look demonic. She looked painfully, profoundly unwell. Dark hollows under her eyes, hair unwashed. The single, notable feature was the quality of her silence. When I spoke to her, the lack of response wasn't hostility. It was a vacuous absence, as if the light behind her eyes had simply burned out. The parents' narrative, recorded initially on case tape MR47. Michael spoke with the clipped, panicked tone of a man trying to logic his way out of a burning building. It started small, Pastor Thorne. Like typical teen stuff. Mood swings, isolating herself. Then the voices. Not really hers. Sometimes distorted, always muffled, like talking through cotton. He ran a hand repeatedly over his thinning hair. The scratching starts late now, against her bedroom wall. And the smell. Sarah, exhausted and tearful, described the shift in the aura of the house, using words that an accountant's wife shouldn't know. We installed a sound meter. The frequency spikes into the low negative range right outside her door. And I find these. Always. Near her bed. She slid a small Ziploc bag across the spotless coffee table. Inside were 3 small, hard black clumps of a densely matted material. It looked like hair, but felt wrong, too brittle, too coarse, like the remnants of burned wire insulation. My skepticism, though always present, began to yield. The family's cohesion was gone. The atmosphere of the house, which should have been clean, airy, and full of pleasant pine scent, was instead saturated by a metallic, coppery smell and a damp, low-grade buzzing that resonated in the sinuses. Physical deterioration was happening, that was a fact. The logical explanation was extreme adolescent schizoid disorder, a manic physical breakdown. But the recordings told a different story. I spent the first 2 nights, the crucial audit period, armed with my thermal camera, 2 independent EMF readers constantly recording, and the voice-activated digital recorder. I set up camp in the spare room directly across the hall from Emily's, a tactical hub that gave me direct observation of her closed door. For 48 hours, I kept vigilance. The first incident, logged with detached certainty in my case notes, as MR49 segment A4. It was 1:17 a.m. My EMF reader, a calibrated device that ignores normal current fluctuation, came alive, screaming the presence of an impossibly strong magnetic field surrounding Emily's closed door. The thermal scanner revealed nothing, no physical heat signature, just a cold, undisturbed surface. Then came the sound. Not a voice, not a scratch. It was a precise, rhythmic rap, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. At first, I foolishly thought it was Morse code, a pattern. I listened carefully, but I realized quickly that the rhythm was just complex. It was mechanical, deliberate, and clearly originating from what sounded like an adult hand slapping the inside of her cheap, laminated pressboard door. The sound resonated with physical force. It wasn't loud enough to wake the average person, but it was aggressive. I grabbed the voice recorder and crept to her door, listening with an experienced ear. The rapping stopped, replaced momentarily by silence, then the sound of a sharp inhale of breath, coming from deep inside the room. Like a person starting a panic attack, breathing so hard their diaphragm was spasming. I waited 5 minutes, recording the silence. Nothing. I returned to my room, checking the EMF. It was back down to normal, flatlining. The rapping was purposeful, a brief, aggressive declaration of presence, then instant, chilling withdrawal. The following night, the declaration was different. I was wide awake, waiting for the familiar rapping to return. It came at 2:05 a.m., but it was not mechanical. It started from beneath her bedroom floor, a low, wet, almost subterranean sound that slowly slid up the wall like a snake climbing vertically. Once it reached the level of Emily's bed, the sound changed. It became the snapping of teeth. I am talking about a sound that no living animal, certainly no small, domesticated animal, could produce. It was the powerful, terrifying click of something with extraordinary bite force closing its jaws, repeatedly, fast, wetly, and furiously, right next to the wall. It was the sound of a violent, hungry threat. I pounded on Emily's door. "Emily! Are you awake? Honey, are you all right?" I threw human concern out there, trying to break the trance. The snapping stopped. Immediate, profound silence. Then, for the first time, I heard a sound from the supposed subject, Emily. From within the room, separated by a thin door, came a word, flat and devoid of youthful emotion. It was not her voice, but lower, older, with a startling lack of texture. "The tape is running, preacher." The shock was total, instantaneous. That single phrase contained multiple, deliberate assaults. The contemptuous use of a non-existent rank, preacher, was reserved for religious fanatics and TV exorcists, and a perfect confirmation that this entity was fully aware of my entire mission and methodology. The fact that I was running an unacknowledged voice recorder. It demonstrated awareness, sentience, and profound ridicule. The entity wasn't hiding. It was displaying its full access to my efforts. At that moment, at 2:07 a.m. on a sterile Monday morning, this stopped being a crisis and became a spiritual investigation, a direct, cognitive duel between a tired man and a cold, focused intruder. The next 3 days were a descent into psychological trench warfare. The manifestation of the sounds became more precise, more targeted to provoke my professional anxiety. On Tuesday afternoon, during my quiet interview with Emily, she was lying on the couch in a state of catatonic apathy. I focused on trying to get a neutral baseline, using simple questions. "Do you like school? Do you have friends?" Then it spoke through her. When I asked, "Who are you?" the head on the pillow remained utterly still, and when it spoke, the sound was not in a traditional place. It was behind me, from the wall near the kitchen entrance, spoken in a clear, resonant but absolutely disembodied male voice. The uninvited. Michael Morris, standing in the doorway filling out a log report, dropped his clipboard on the spot. Even Michael, who clung desperately to the idea of a gas leak or mass panic disorder, was shaken by the sheer quality of the vocal projection, audible, spatial, undeniable. Following the initial vocal outburst, every sound became an attack on the family's sanity. Doors didn't just slam shut. They slid closed slowly, then a single, precise crack emerged in the surface. Light bulbs didn't shatter. The filaments inside them simply popped as if fried by a surge only they could sense. The family dog, a hyper-alert terrier named Max, was discovered frozen solid under Emily's bed, not physically cold, but rigid, in a deeply catatonic state that seemed to defy physical trauma. The vet was horrified. Max wasn't injured, he had simply checked out of consciousness. The demonic entity, if that is the correct clinical term, wasn't seeking sensational exposure. It was seeking the subtle, deliberate erosion of comfort and the subsequent removal of every source of emotional security, all in service of one goal: isolating Emily. That was my conclusion presented to the Morrises in the kitchen 4 days after my arrival. This is not about the house, and likely not specifically about the girl. It's about an opening that occurred when she was under profound stress, perhaps after a traumatic event, which made her a magnet. The entity has attached itself, and its primary goal is not to perform a spectacle, but to drain her reserves and those of the family until she is a clean, receptive vehicle. A clean vehicle for what? Sarah pleaded, her face tear-streaked and puffy. Whatever it is using her life force as psychological and spiritual currency to make its presence felt and to destroy your world's predictability. I stated flatly. It is cold, calculated, and intensely territorial. It spoke to me through her, not to mock me, but to tell you that it knows you're trying to send it away, and it is readying itself for the full, non-ambiguous confrontation. As I spoke those last words, the most aggressive and non-vocal attack occurred. The chandelier, a large, multi-paned glass fixture above the formal dining room table, began to twist. It didn't wobble or shake. It started turning very slowly to its left, as if someone was deliberately trying to screw it out of the mounting plate on the ceiling. It took a full minute, with a high-pitched, grinding creak, for it to shift a quarter turn. The sound ceased. The chandelier hung there, menacingly askew. The ambient pressure on my eardrums increased, and the metallic odor intensified, making my eyes water. Then I watched with abject, cold horror as a singular object lifted from the center of the wooden dining table below it. It was Michael Morris' brand new, black, glass-heavy ceramic coffee mug. It weighed about 2 pounds. It slid, defying gravity without any external help, off the surface of the dry wood table, lifted vertically about 2 inches, and turned exactly 90 degrees to face me, as if held by a perfectly invisible, angry hand. And then it simply exploded. Not breaking from a fall, but an outright detonation. The ceramic mug and the nearly dry remnants of cold coffee within blew apart with a sound like a small caliber bullet being fired, shattering the remains into tiny, clean, shrapnel-like shards of pure black. I felt the dry spray of coffee hit my blazer. The Morizas and I stood frozen. No sound. No movement. Just the ringing aftermath of the glass explosion. The attack was physical, violent, and had occurred in a moment of extreme psychological tension. The creature was no longer merely manipulating the environment. It was using focused, raw kinetic power at a target chosen for its symbolism. I grabbed Michael and Sarah by the arms, moving entirely in an autopilot urgency. "We're done here. We have everything we need. You are out now. You are no closer to the problem, and whatever this uninvited thing is, it is now actively trying to harm you." They were too terrified and too broken to argue. We gathered Emily, who moved like a heavy, sleepwalking doll. They didn't even pack suitcases. They just walked out the front door, leaving the exploded coffee mug, the shattered light bulbs, the traumatized dog, and the perpetually hum-saturated air of the hilltop house behind them, driving off to the only sanctuary left for them. Michael's brother's suburban home, 2 states away. A place the uninvited couldn't know or predict. I stayed behind for the final, necessary act. My job as crisis investigator was to assess the level of spiritual threat. My job now was to confirm the source. I retrieved the largest, most crucial piece of evidence that the mother had provided, the bag of black matted clumps of hair-like material. I took the samples to the dead center of Emily's cold, airless room, locked inside for what I knew would be the last, terrifying encounter. I had a hypothesis, rooted in some deeply disturbing historical archives I'd accessed during my time in Rome. If this was a deep spiritual or low-grade demonic presence, rather than simple haunting, I had to test its attachment point. I found the smallest sample, placed it on the floor of the room, my back flat against the wall, rifle-like posture with my thermal scanner and recorder at the ready, and then, I simply spoke into the empty air, projecting authority I almost certainly didn't possess. "I am officially closing the case and evacuating the premises. The vessel is gone. The focus is concluded. What remains has neither tether nor name outside the house." Total silence. I waited one full, slow, terrifying minute. Then, very slowly, I took a heavy, solid bronze cross from my blazer's inside pocket, a gift from an old mentor, blessed for use on neutral ground, and positioned it perfectly atop the tiny black clump of material on the hard, bare floor. The 2 objects made contact, the cold, smooth metal settling onto the rough, brittle fibers. The reaction was instantaneous and savage. The sound that erupted from nowhere at the point of contact was not a human noise, but a screaming shriek so high, so piercing and sharp it felt like it would tear the very air into ribbons. My own ears started popping violently, and the glass voice recorder I'd carefully positioned on the windowsill exploded, this time not with a bang, but that same shattering, pressure-induced TSSSSHK sound that characterized the attacks. And then physical reaction came, not an invisible, precise motion, but a desperate, furious struggle. The metal cross, heavy and ancient, started to vibrate so fiercely against the floor it sounded like a jackhammer starting through concrete. Then it started moving erratically, shaking, and sliding with enormous speed in a violent attempt to break contact with the black material beneath it until it had managed to fling itself backward to the baseboard with an audible thud. The attack against the objects was so intense, so clearly a declaration of pain upon the application of a purifying, organized spiritual force, that I felt a profound, chilling internal certainty. I had correctly identified the source. The matted black material was not hair or a physical anomaly. It was the spiritual remnant, an anchor, a form of spiritual dirt, accumulated by the uninvited that it sheds over time but needs to remain on the premises for its tether. Whatever this being was, or is, it exists by being tethered to a focus, isolating its vessel, and feeding its malice for years unobserved, using subtle psychological terror to destabilize its core target. Confront it with an organized purpose, attack its anchor point with a pure, non-secular spiritual energy, and it freaks out like a captured animal, attacking the nearest object with extreme violence to break the connection. I left the house locked just as I'd found it, the black clump still on the floor, the spiritual battlefield littered with the exploded objects. I sent the family away, changed my address, and officially dissolved my investigative service. The terrifying realization of the Hilltop case wasn't the demonic noise. It was the cold, analytical depth of what's out there. The uninvited is not a fire and brimstone creature, it's an existential cynic. It studies you, knows your weaknesses, and uses modern appliances, everyday sounds, and psychological isolation against you until the sheer impossibility of finding a logical escape is what finally, sweetly, breaks your mind and your spirit. And you can't run from cynicism. All you can do is surround yourself with pure, life-affirming presence. I haven't been alone, in darkness, or out of earshot of other living, breathing human beings since I left the cold, sterile hallways of the Moriz's beautiful, empty house on the hilltop. Story 4. They called it the Black Frontier Sanatorium, even years after the last patient had shuffled out and the doors were bolted shut by the state. It sat sprawling and massive on top of a low ridge outside of Peoria, Illinois, a jagged collection of gray stone buildings that once promised treatment for everything from consumption to acute mania. Officially, it was closed due to budgetary constraints in 1993. Based on the local stories, the reason was far simpler. The place was deeply, profoundly, and corrosively broken. My name is Dale, and I spent a considerable portion of my 30s as part of an independent crew dedicated less to ghost hunting and more to urban forensics, or urbex. We weren't amateurs. We were focused on documentation, history, and genuine structural investigation, equipped with high-end photographic gear and serious safety protocols. My current assignment was with the Echo team, a small unit of 3, myself, lead researcher/documentation, Mark, security/entry specialist, and the perpetually skeptical, perpetually silent Ben, field recorder/audio engineer. Mark, Ben, and I had been chasing the unsettling history of the sanatorium for 6 months through archives and old blueprints. The history was bleak: experimental lobotomies, patient disappearances, questionable water supplies, and overcrowding during the polio epidemic. By the time we finally found an access point that didn't risk life and limb, a busted service shaft in the utility wing facing the woods, the atmosphere alone should have provided immediate closure to the venture. The air inside the Black Frontier was the deep, thick cold that suggests no solar warmth has touched the interior in decades. It smelled of stagnant water, decaying formaldehyde, and that unique, high-pitched metallic tang that only seems to exist in long-abandoned healthcare facilities. We moved, single file, 3 high-output LED headlamps piercing the absolute darkness. Our objective, the solarium observation wing, the notorious area of the 1960s behavioral modification work, located on the building's upper floor. It was a section sealed off since the 1970s, where patients were simply left in near-complete silence. A local legend insisted that a final, agonizing log of patient observations was still hidden behind the main nurse's station wall. Pure folklore, we thought, but worth the documentation attempt. The ground floor was everything you'd expect: chipped linoleum, overturned wheelchairs, and the detritus of hasty abandonment. It was loud, chaotic decay. We secured our initial checkpoints on the lower level, marks spraying small orangey C. Echo checkpoint markers as we went, leaving the lower level sensory investigation to the cameras we secured to structural beams. For physical protection, we carried no weapons, only our wits, our lights, and long, heavy metal pipes we used for clearing debris and defense. It was on the main staircase, leading up to the second floor, that the change began. The transition from chaos to silence was immediate. The second floor was deathly quiet, as if the thick, cracked plaster walls were absorbing all sound. Even our heavy safety boots, which clattered loudly on the lower steps, seemed to thud soundlessly on the second floor's cracked concrete. The EMF reader, which was flat on the ground level, started to spike into the high, sustained red zone directly over the second floor landing. We paused, our headlamps dancing in the dust-moody silence. "Elevated field," Ben muttered, his first words in an hour. His face looked pale and pinched in the light. "Nothing local. No power lines nearby. Something's broadcasting hard up here." Mark, ever the professional, just pointed his light down the long, empty tiled corridor. "Hallway Gamma. Let's make this clinical, guys. We have 3 hours before our agreed-upon extraction window." We reached Hallway Gamma, a narrow, airless corridor off the main medical hub. The doors here were heavy, steel-enforced, with thick, small wire-meshed observations panels set into the upper half. These were the more secure rooms, probably for the more volatile or catatonic patients. The dust had settled entirely here, lending the place an incredible, almost historical stillness. As we walked, an undeniable, concentrated smell started. It was overpowering, a cloying, almost surgical scent that reeked of iron, antiseptic agents, and something profoundly animal, an odor almost akin to a cage full of heavily sweated mammals. It was the absolute, lingering scent of unmedicated misery. Then the lights came on. We were far past the external power grid. We were operating deep in darkness. Yet, as we passed the cluster of rooms around the hallway's midpoint, 2 of the observation panels, those thick, wire mesh glass squares in the steel doors, suddenly gave off a strong, but localized, flickering amber glow. It wasn't a practical light source. It was an interior glow, almost like an old kerosene lantern had been positioned perfectly inside the solitary cell. The light pulsed, soft and weak, giving the 2 cells' interior only the barest wash of agitated illumination. But it was bright enough to outline something disturbing. "No, no, and hard no," Mark whispered, his voice tense, pulling down the neck of his tactical glove. "That's not physical. It can't be." We brought our lights down. No wires. No exterior power delivery. Ben's EMF spiked again, confirming massive localized energy. But it was Ben who caught the absolute worst detail. "Guys, look closely at the walls there, against the light. Above the doors." We angled our lamps again. On the concrete wall area directly above the 2 flickering panels, an area that was otherwise immaculate in terms of dirt and decay, a pattern began to resolve itself. It looked like an old, black, chalky residue, slowly coalescing in the light. In the dim, flickering amber wash, the residue resolved into a deeply unsettling, chaotic pattern of hundreds of tiny, childish figures, drawn, scrawled, seemingly etched into the dark grime. They looked like stick figures, but with terrifying attention to open, screaming mouths. I pulled out my portable UV scanner. It showed no organic or biological material. The black residue, whatever it was, wasn't simple dirt. It was pure, unadulterated graphical decay, activated by an outside source. The thing in the rooms wanted to be seen. The atmosphere tightened. We didn't need to speak to know that something profoundly malign, something using the residual despair of the patients, was trying to communicate visually and energetically. We pulled completely past those 2 illuminated cells and moved further down the silent corridor. We were looking for room 217, the theorized observation solarium annex. At the far end of the hallway, we found it. No door. Just a thick sheet of plywood clumsily screwed into the frame, with thick yellow police tape disintegrating upon its surface. The number plate was missing. We quickly located and removed the access screws, pulling off the plywood sheet with a wet schlock sound. We shone our lights in. The room beyond was dark, freezing, and full of the same oppressive historical stillness. There wasn't another window in the room, making it total, lightless darkness. We stepped in, and the true sound began from the depths of the room. Not a bang, not a whisper. It was the sound of a single metal cot, pushed hard against the concrete floor, slowly, rhythmically, scraping back and forth against the smooth concrete with an awful, grinding sound. We raised our hands, signaling an halt. Ben's audio recorder was held out in the dark, pointed directly into the void. The methodical grind scrape of the cot resonated in the absolute silence. Mark advanced first, weapon pipe held close, illuminating the room carefully. There was an extremely small cot jammed almost vertically onto its side at the far end of the room. It looked like a small child's cot, its cold, metal legs splayed. And there was nothing touching it. It moved against the floor with its own independent, violent energy. Psychokinetic, I whispered to the others. It's a clear focus event. But the focus of the event wasn't the material object. It was the space where the noise happened. Once Mark stepped through into the clearing in the center, the scraping noise stopped immediately. It was back to the total silence that felt like a sensory deprivation tank, but one that was full of the metallic, sick-sweet smell of decay. As Ben and I joined Mark in the center clearing, trying to get our bearings, the entire team's thermal equipment blacked out simultaneously. All three of our monitors went dead from an apparent localized electrical surge. My backup sensors, Mark's night vision oculars, and Ben's external thermal pack. All of our redundant power sources, suddenly and completely nullified by a hostile interference. We were blind, reliant only on the thin beam of our headlamps, surrounded by the utter, freezing darkness of a hostile room, where a metallic scent hung heavy, and a cot was capable of independent movement. The air suddenly felt dense, like water against the eardrums. Then, from the absolute black corner of the room, near the one door that led to two other smaller, side rooms, came a sound so deeply upsetting, so completely wrong, that I felt my stomach surge with pure, cold nausea. It was the sound of someone eating with extreme prejudice. Not a slight chew, but a wet, messy, violent slurp and smack sound, lips being pressed together, something soft being torn off a hard object, an absolute, disgusting concentration of force dedicated to consuming something rapidly in the dark. It wasn't a human sound. Something in its rhythm was just too fast, too aggressive, too full of desperation, the sound bouncing off the cold, hard walls. The thing, whatever it was at the entrance to the inner rooms, and it was feeding. Again, no lights. No thermal signature. Just the sound of cold, hungry consumption. Mark, the ex-army professional, made his choice immediately. He wasn't going to open up a single round of live action with a sound entity. He turned slowly, holding his heavy, metal crowbar. He swung wide, catching the air. Let's back out. Now. No sudden movements. As we slowly backed out of the room, one step taken every 5 seconds, 3 sets of eyes peering into the absolute dark pool of the inner annex where the feeding sound resided. The sound didn't stop. It got louder, hungrier, and more aggressive in pace. It was a clear indication that it was fully aware of our fearful retreat. We managed to get the last man out. Ben quickly slammed the plywood back into position with a loud crack that reverberated through the now hostile stillness. We then bolted quickly out of that corridor, skipping over the 2 cells that glowed with malevolent amber light, knowing with cold certainty they were merely 2 empty holding pens that fed their collective despair to whatever was housed in room 217. We fled the building, running, not walking, through the vast maze of the upper floors, and only stopped to breathe when we were crashing through the service shaft we had come through an hour earlier. We stood back outside beneath the cold Illinois stars, gulping the fresh, frigid autumn air that smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a million miles away from the decay of the inner corridors. Our cameras were fine, the lights and thermos simply dead from what Ben assessed as a localized energy dampening field. The entity projected, designed to blind any methodical, organized investigation. We drove 500 miles away before we finally stopped, pulled into a brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner, and spent an hour analyzing the recovered audio from Ben's shielded field recorder. The scraping of the cot was clearly and loudly visible on the playback. The electrical interference spikes were evident, and the aggressive, nauseating sounds of consumption from room 217 were there, raw, chilling, and undeniable. But what caused me to quit that life was the final 15 seconds of the recording, the residual aftermath not caught by our human ears. The sound was too faint, hidden immediately following the slamming of the plywood sheet. If you filtered out the noise below 60 dB, a new layer resolved itself. It wasn't human. It was an echoing, faint, multi-layered, whispering laughter, not human merriment, but the wet, airy, chaotic, and satisfied laughter of a victorious predator, an echoing cascade of tiny, joyful whispers, seemingly emitted simultaneously from every acoustic corner of the room. It was the absolute, final, hateful release of a being that had successfully chased away its intruders, and now could return to its preferred activity, unbothered, alone in the dark. Feasting. I sold off my surveillance gear and put down all my documentation. I stopped chasing the deep spiritual darkness embedded in these forgotten structures. I'll never go near a forgotten hospital, or any building known to house suffering, again. Because they aren't merely haunted by sad ghosts. They are repositories of collective human pain, and sometimes an intelligence gathers this emotional despair until it becomes self-cognizant, capable of isolating itself, obscuring the truth, and feeding on the living, cold and undisturbed in its black corner. I choose to live in the full, constant, high-frequency light of other people now, because I know that in the silence of the abandoned halls of places like the Black Frontier, something is waiting for you to walk in and break their silence, just so they can enjoy the sounds of your retreat. Story 5. My name is Mike, and I work the graveyard shift, or the ghost shift, as we privately called it, at the Atlas Distribution Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was a cathedral of consumerism, an absolutely enormous, cavernous structure running 3 city blocks long, focused on fulfilling endless e-commerce orders. My job was simple: clean, restock, and watch the sensors. I was officially the lone maintenance supervisor from midnight to 5 a.m., the man in charge of a warehouse larger than 5 football fields, utterly and profoundly alone, with nothing but the high bay fluorescent lighting that hummed like a planetary engine. The Atlas Center followed a stringent, German-level operational procedure. On the graveyard shift, the entire volume was completely locked down. All production staff were gone by 11:30 p.m. The automated, self-driving forklifts were parked in their chargers. Only emergency lights and my cleaning caddy remained mobile. The absolute silence in which I was forced to operate, a silence broken only by my sweeping broom, the persistent whine of the HVAC, and the sound of my own footsteps echoing across waxed concrete, is what eventually broke my sanity. The first few months were just monotonous, a grinding routine set to the metronome of my portable music player. But when you are alone in a confined space that large, designed to house 10,000 people, your mind wants to find movement, desires to find a presence. Eventually, I stopped listening to my music because I learned the structure itself was speaking back. Or at least the lack of something within it was doing the talking. Atlas had 3 levels of storage. Level 0, the sorting floor, was where I worked. Level 1, small items, was above me. And then there was Level 3, an extremely high utility and bulk storage area, almost 50 feet up, a ceiling of endless shelving where non-consumables and off-site materials were stored. Level 3 was structurally massive, windowless, and permanently closed off, accessible only by a single high-voltage operated industrial elevator whose key was kept locked in the supervisor's depot, a full kilometer away from the lift itself, and which was supposed to never be used except for a city-level safety inspection. My first anomaly was the smell. Around 2:30 a.m., when I finished the northern half of the warehouse and began turning towards the dark center known as the crossdock, a powerful, transient scent started wafting down from the higher levels. It was the absolute, unmistakable odor of salt water and dead fish. Tulsa is landlocked, over 1,000 miles from either coast. No staff worked high up, No containers were being delivered that day, and the smell was powerful and distinct, not transient or residual. It would start as a dense, pungent cloud high overhead in the center area, linger for about 15 minutes as I swept up to it, and then, when I neared the area, it would simply vanish, leaving only the sanitized smell of mild floor cleaner. The smell became the herald of the shift. Then came the sound a month later, also highly concentrated on level 3. I knew the difference between steel shifting, concrete settling, and the sound of an honest-to-God drag. This wasn't a settling or a pop of cooled metal. It was a precise, drawn-out scrapppp, long, abrasive, and high up. It was the sound of a very heavy, stiff-legged body being slowly and powerfully dragged across the smooth concrete floor of level 3, high above my head, a rhythmic sound of awful friction. I would freeze up against a pallet stack, staring up into the shadows above the industrial ceiling lights. I saw the movement of the dust particles suspended in the dead air. I heard the scrape, and I could tell by the reverberation that the sound was deep within level 3, hundreds of feet from the utility access hatch. It would last for perhaps 30 seconds, moving in slow, rhythmic intervals, and then stop suddenly, with a final, heavy thud. Silence would return, the hum of the lighting fixtures now seeming impossibly loud. I was alone. The security cameras only recorded externally. There was no way anyone could bypass the locks, defeat the motion detectors running on level 0. Ascend to the sealed-off level 3, and drag a massive object around silently without triggering any environmental sensors, which were my main area of monitoring. I started documenting the incidents in a small notebook, calling the presence the manager, a silent, industrial force observing me from the high-up, controlled silence of his unreachable domain. I quickly realized the manager didn't like order. If I left a cart crooked, or a stack of cardboard slightly askew, the scraping noises on level 3 would be muted and barely noticeable. But if I made the level clean, orderly, and sterile, the manager's scraping would intensify into an abrasive scream, and I would freeze up against the machinery, unable to move until the terrifying silence settled back down. It was almost like a petulant child being woken up by the perfect silence of an empty house. It was during my longest shift, a pre-holiday inventory in late November, that the manager finally broke the perimeter fence of silence and isolation with something far more terrifying: vocal imitation. It was 3:45 a.m. I was pushing my heavy, four-wheeled aluminum cleaning cart past a massive automated assembly zone, an enormous collection of silent conveyor belts, robotic arms, and stacked inventory. Level 3 stretched darkly above me. The scraping had been loud and insistent for the preceding hour. I was stressed, fatigued, and my vigilance was razor-thin. As I pushed the cart past the empty staff break room, which was only a wall of thin drywall, I heard a sound from the other side. A perfectly human voice. It was a man's voice, deeply familiar, yet utterly out of place. It was the clear, unaccented voice of my supervisor, a guy named Rick, who was supposed to be 20 miles away, home, sleeping. I'd seen him leave hours ago. Rick's voice, just loud enough to cut through the hum of the fluorescent fixtures, said one single, horrifying sentence. Is someone using my access card on level 3? I stopped moving, adrenaline flooding my system. Rick's voice was flat, professional, and slightly confused, as if asking an important procedural question of another employee. Only there was no other employee, and nobody would be asking that specific question in deep warehouse isolation. The sound came from the empty room, and it was a perfectly captured audio facsimile. It wasn't a ghost calling a name. It was a targeted moment of paranoia, focused entirely on the locked, forbidden area, level 3. Was someone there? Did you let them in? Did they use your means? This entity had now taken the ability to mimic, to induce confusion, and aim it professionally at my deepest work anxiety. I did the only logical thing. I dropped my cleaning supply bottle, walked past the doorway, around a corner, and made a full-speed dash to the emergency key depot. I wasn't going to call the central security company I knew wouldn't be able to provide any help. I was going to find the utility elevator key, walk a kilometer back, unlock and access level 3 for 5 terrifying, adrenaline-fueled minutes, and either resolve this thing physically or expose the charade. I retrieved the key, a long, silver cylinder with a brass end, from its secured metal locker, bolted with a triple lock as per federal regulations. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the key. My mind screamed at me, go to level 3. Address the issue. Shut it down. I was in a fugue state, entirely driven by the need to disprove the reality this creature was creating around me. I sprinted back into the main arena, focusing my effort on the massive industrial elevator bay. As I approached its gleaming chrome doors, still panting from the run, I got my next, final, and most terrifying sign. Directly on the smooth, polished stainless steel door of the utility access elevator, the door that led to levels 1, 2, a sealed crawl space nobody used, and 3, was a patch of something dark, wet, and glistening in the harsh fluorescent lighting. It was concentrated, almost perfectly round, wet, and smelled powerfully. The sickening odor of raw salt water and rotting fish flesh, and etched precisely onto the greasy smear of ocean decay. Using what appeared to have been a very heavy, rigid claw, was a set of characters. Not Latin letters, but heavy, complex, deliberate striations in the dirt, like hieroglyphics designed only to convey pressure. They looked like 5 bold, thick, deep scratches, crossed 3 times, like the most basic representation of a cage or prison cell, each crossing 1 millimeter deep into the soft metal of the door. This was no human entry. This was the entity, the manager, marking its territory, demonstrating its reach, and sending a clear, violent signal that it was aware of my intentions to ascend to the single point of entry to the level that was its sanctuary. And its presence, in a landlocked warehouse, saturated the core entry point with the impossible certainty of cold, dead ocean. I dropped the heavy elevator key with a clang that echoed for 5 entire seconds down the hallway. I turned around, walked away quickly, not running, to avoid any sound that may cause the manager to emerge or reveal itself in a physical way, collected my discarded cleaning caddy, and slowly pushed it across the last 100 yards of clean steel floor, my eyes permanently fixed to the enormous, empty verticality of the level 3 darkness above me. I clocked out exactly on time, 5 a.m., walking out into the weak gray pre-dawn light that made the endless parking lot seem almost safe. Rick was the first to arrive, a solid, well-built man in his late 50s, smelling aggressively of coffee, completely oblivious to his own auditory impersonation that had tried to lure me to the high-up, locked space. That day, I tendered my immediate resignation not with an excuse, but a financial settlement, losing 2 weeks' pay, citing profound exhaustion and job fatigue, something a tired maintenance man could conceivably claim. I am back in a large, messy, open-concept downtown office now, sitting between 3 other men, surrounded 16/5 by phone chatter and air conditioning noise. My ultimate conclusion is that whatever I encountered on the ghost shift isn't a ghost. It is a primal, silent force that either was sealed, or decided to shelter itself willingly, in the silent, cold isolation of the abandoned upper level of an ultra-modern corporate space. That silent, controlled environment, utterly alone in the dark, without any human movement to interfere with its existence, had created the perfect hunting ground. The mimicry, the smell of the unreachable ocean, the aggressive movement, the scraping, that was its way of attempting to drive a permanent spike of confusion and fear straight into the last mind that ever entered its silent sanctuary. I lost a good, quiet job there. But the one thing I truly gained that night was the absolute, deep, and final knowledge that I never again want to face an intelligent, predatory silence in a space so vast that it can use its size, its emptiness, and its profound isolation to actively come after your perception of reality. I now live, constantly, with the knowledge that the highest points of any structure in a deeply dark, silent moment are places from which you are being watched by things that are waiting for the perfect moment of isolation and are willing to use your own voice to draw you out of safety. I learned that the cold, dead space of level 3 was already occupied. Story 6. My name is Alan. I live in a modern high-rise development outside of Houston, Texas, working, like most people, an office job that affords me the necessary insulation from the harsh chaos of real city life. I am a man of routines. The predictability of my life, the specific coffee shop, the route to work, the digital schedules, is the bedrock of my sanity. So when the bedrock started to crack, not with a bang, but with an improbable series of almost laughable recurrences, I initially dismissed it. My background is in market risk analysis, which drills a deeply skeptical view into you. Coincidence is merely high probability, never causality. That was my shield. It started innocuously, with the number 73 in the spring of last year. I'd see 73 on license plates while stuck in traffic, notice it on the check at my usual lunch spot, precisely 7.73 on Tuesday and again 17.73 on Friday. It made up the final 2 digits of the phone number I was cold calling, and then, completely randomly, I'd hear a specific lyric about a 73 Mustang pop into my car's shuffle play. It was just data filtering. Your brain locks onto a pattern, and then selects that pattern among the million inputs you receive daily. I noted it but didn't worry. A simple confirmation bias. Then the 73 stopped, and the phenomenon evolved into something else that felt decidedly less charming. It became focused on a particular color and a specific shape. The color was a rare, nauseating shade of electric yellow, nearly lime green, and the shape was a distinct, 3-pronged metal ornament, like a stylized, oversized pitchfork, but softer around the edges, that I'd seen once in a terrible, roadside antique shop in rural East Texas during a weekend drive. This new recurrence was geographically impossible. 3 weeks straight, I saw that electric yellow 3-pronged ornament on 3 completely unrelated objects across the city. First, it was stickered precisely on the main distribution box outside my apartment complex. Then, it was crudely drawn in permanent black marker on the back of a utility van on the opposite side of town when I waited for a light. And finally, when I visited a new client's corporate lobby out by the water treatment plant, I found a small, cheap version of the 3-pronged ornament hanging in one corner of the fish tank display. I went beyond simple observation. I started documenting it. I started taking photographs of these recurrences, building a specific album in my phone labeled, with intentional sarcasm, the pattern files. The collection looked like the work of a deeply paranoid conspiracy theorist, but seeing the visual evidence, the 3-pronged device, rendered in different mediums, in widely different locations, started chipping away at my rational foundation. Why that shape, and why that color? It was too niche to be a mass-distributed logo. It felt personal. The key shift from simple coincidence to calculated threat happened when the pattern started interacting with my routine. The phenomena began to preempt my movements, as if the pattern was being laid down just before I arrived. My routine used to involve taking the back elevator down in the building every morning at 7:45 a.m. after checking the weather. This elevator was nearly always empty. One morning I stepped in, pressing lobby. The car was immaculate, recently repaired. But when the doors sealed shut and the car began its descent, a small card, thin, blank on both sides, with the edges folded inward, fell from the ceiling of the cab and landed squarely on my polished shoe. It had clearly been wedged lightly into the crack of a panel. I bent down, picked it up, expecting a discarded flyer. It was entirely blank except for what was drawn on the reverse side, the electric yellow, 3-pronged ornament, drawn with a precision and familiarity that chilled my blood. It was the same size, same style of drawing as the drawing on the utility van. I got off the elevator shaking, realizing 2 unsettling facts. 1, someone had anticipated that I would be in that particular lift, and 2, they knew enough to place an object that specifically resonated with my private observation patterns directly into my path, forcing me to handle the visual evidence. It was no longer chance. It was personal data harvesting. The next 3 weeks broke my professional skepticism. The recurrences became auditory and temporal. I would start my commute, and always, but only when I was entering the dense, specific mile of highway leading to my office interchange, my car's clock would suddenly, rapidly reset itself backward exactly 22 minutes. 22 minutes. Every single day. Just as the pattern was settling on 73 foot or the 3 times before, here was a new one, -22:00. I had the car's electrical system completely audited. The dealer found nothing. The synchronization was perfect every day, always during that specific mile of monotonous asphalt, and it resynchronized exactly 22 minutes behind the actual time, then started ticking again. When I tried to use a parallel, secondary source of time, setting my expensive analog wristwatch forward 22 minutes to see if it would correct itself, it refused to correct. But when I set it backwards 22 minutes to match the car clock exactly, the car clock then delayed itself an additional 2 minutes, defying my attempt to control the temporal recurrence. It was being provoked. Whatever was doing this was responding to my attempts to break the pattern. It was playing within the logical laws of causality only to expose its ability to bend these same rules whenever it felt defied. The horror was in the absolute knowledge that the ordinary fabric of time and location was being manipulated by an outside, cognizant source. My world wasn't chaotic. It was a simulation with a hostile programmer. I went to my therapist, a man named David Stein who looked understandably stressed out from 12 hours of listening to people who were having real problems. I described the recurrence, the colors, the strange ornament, the temporal attacks in my car. Dr. Stein listened with patient, clinical concern, concluding over several sessions that I was suffering from acute obsessive recognition sensation compounded by mild paraphrenia, the beginnings of a disconnect from reality where external visual noise had become personal. "Alan," he said, adjusting his glasses one late afternoon, "if every single person you interacted with daily, from the mail carrier to the barista, started saying the word cucumber at you, entirely in context, what would you think? I'd think I was either going crazy, or I'd accidentally discovered a coded cell of local political spies," I replied honestly. "No, Alan," he insisted firmly. "You recognize the pattern, but the world, the consensus, is not in on the conspiracy. The conspiracy is only visible subjectively, through your lens. Whatever this is, it can't cross the boundary of shared reality." I nearly believed him. His logic was comforting. I decided to make one last, determined effort to break the urban recurrence phenomenon I suddenly found myself in. I was going to violate the pattern. I drove to the exact opposite side of Houston during a quiet Sunday afternoon when I was usually at home, parked my untouched, clean system sedan at a dusty, forgotten lot near the abandoned rail yards, and planned to simply sit there for 5 hours, reading a dense book and drinking a simple can of soda, an absolute violation of all my routines. I sat there isolated, watching the dust motes dance in the heat coming off the asphalt, the only car in a sea of cracked, oily concrete surrounding a dead factory. Time stretched. My temporal stability was uncorrected. No flickering lights. No sense of observance. A full 4 hours passed and I felt a profound, almost luxurious relief. I was healing. That's when I heard the sound that confirmed everything he said was irrelevant. Out on the street next to the chain-link perimeter fence, a vehicle slowed down. It wasn't the sound of an average car. The engine was quieted, yet the size suggested a large pickup truck. It came to a complete stop directly on the street, precisely aligned with my sedan, only about 50 feet away. I froze, heart pounding. My hands went immediately, defensively, to my lap. Then the sound of the truck's door being opened, a thick metal groan, followed by 3 distinct, deliberate footsteps as a person walked right up to the chain-link fence. I slowly, microscopically, brought my head up just far enough to crane my eyesight over the lip of my door frame and peer through the streaked window glass. The sun was setting right behind the vehicle, silhouetting the figure that was standing by the fence. It wasn't a person. Not in the ordinary sense. It was an empty, perfectly black shape of human height and width, framed against the low, caustic orange light of the setting sun. The figure was utterly without identifying features. No coat texture, no hairline, no facial definition. A pure lack of light, a standing silhouette devoid of any measurable dimension. It stood completely motionless, looking directly toward my car. I could have perhaps written that abstract profile off to a trick of the falling light. but I couldn't account for what it was now holding up in its right, perfectly blank arm. The shape paused, completely still, and raised a long, stiff arm toward my direction. Hanging limply but visibly from a thread of dried wire, in the air between the shape and my car window, was a small object. It was metallic, reflecting the small beams of late Texas light. The color was that sickening, bright electric yellow. Its shape was perfectly, clearly resolved. It was the three-pronged ornament they had drawn into life, hanging there like a terrible pendulum, swinging gently, mockingly, precisely in front of its head. It was now an active encounter. The entity had followed my attempt at randomness to the remote location, confirmed my address by following my pattern, and was now actively delivering a materialized item that was once confined to my photographs, bringing it physically into my space to fully tear down the boundary between subjective observation and objective terror. It was forcing a direct physical reaction. I wasn't sure if it was feeding on my fear, or if it was just establishing its dominance over my perception of reality. But I didn't want to become data fodder. I put the book down silently, started the ignition with a smooth twist of the key, put the sedan in drive, and peeled out of the lot, throwing gravel and oil dust into the air. I didn't watch as I swung the bulky sedan hard onto the main road, but as I glanced in my rapidly diminishing side mirror, I caught the slightest, final flash. The massive pickup, pitch black, windowless, and absolutely devoid of any discernible license plate lettering or logo I could identify, was now turned neatly, facing straight down the road, and it was following me, keeping pace until I took the first hard right toward the freeway ramp. The shadow, the car, the relentless patterns, they were not simply coincidences or subjective errors of perception. They were the highly organized, profoundly malevolent tactics of a non-dimensional stalker that used the very predictability of human life and technology against its victim, closing the logical door until the only thing left for me was to violently contradict my own routine just to stay ahead of the next attack. Now, 6 months after the encounter, I live in a state of controlled micro-chaos. I have 4 different phones, 5 email addresses, and I never use a password, route, or routine for more than 4 weeks at a time. I deliberately take the worst traffic lanes, choose the busiest stores, eat in crowded, loud cafeterias, and surround myself with every distraction possible. I have a collection of old, cheap, imprecise analog clocks, and my car's main display is simply covered with black tape. Because here is the profound, terrifying truth I learned: randomness is safe. Identity, structure, and order are the targets. The creature that stalks me is still out there, its electric yellow lure is everywhere, using the mundane patterns of my life as a tracking signal to find me. Its greatest weapon is not the fear itself but the realization that I cannot trust the stable, predictable clockwork of the universe. In the most advanced, rational, organized pockets of American urban life, an entity is using our own logic to hunt us, reminding us that no single person is truly safe from the quiet predator that hides in the statistical anomaly. Story 7. My name is Garrett, and for 20 years I managed a sprawling, beautifully dilapidated bed and breakfast in the heart of the antebellum South, specifically, outside of Natchez, Mississippi. Most people think of Southern B&Bs as charming, historical, and deeply hospitable. Wellow Manor, built in 1845, certainly had the charm of old money, but its hospitality felt profoundly conditional. I acquired it through an odd probate mess, an inheritance from a distant, unknown relative, and went into business expecting to trade on the ghosts. What I got was a haunting so melancholy and possessive that it drained the entire environment of warmth and color. It wasn't a poltergeist like in the New England case. Mrs. Willow, or whatever remained of her, was not aggressive, or kinetic, or loud. She was sad. That was her weapon, a profound, historical, systemic sadness that permeated the very wooden fibers of the construction and imposed itself upon whomever tried to occupy her space. The grounds were stunning, towering willows, an oppressive humidity that felt weighty and damp, and deep bayou swamps just visible through the morning mist, giving everything a washed-out, sepia-toned quality. From day one, the challenge was less about fixing the dry rot and more about enduring the palpable atmosphere of utter despair. It was evident from the start. Guests, particularly writers and artists who booked the remote seclusion suite, would cancel after a single night, always citing unbearable pressure, a weeping sickness, or an immediate, crushing sense of isolation. The manor was beautiful, but the silence inside was heavy and thick, a tangible, emotional substance that made every breath an effort. My own experiences started subtly. Mrs. Willow, I had researched her name, Clara May Willow, after a failed, long marriage and the simultaneous loss of her 3 children to a fever epidemic in the 1870s, was constantly observing me, silently, reproachfully. The most common manifestation was the cold spot. Not a sudden gust of wind, but permanent ambient cold that defied thermodynamics. It was always localized in 5 places: the center of the old library, where the family records burned, the 3rd step on the landing leading to the 2nd floor, the foot of the enormous mahogany 4-poster bed in the master suite, and uniquely, it always focused relentlessly on the skin between my left shoulder blade and my spine when I was alone, sitting for more than 10 minutes. It was a cold point that I couldn't escape with any external heating from a fire, and it didn't travel when I moved. It would simply stop the moment I began walking, and then wait in that exact spot for my return. It felt like the persistent, icy touch of a highly emotional focus. I tried to combat the overwhelming sadness and atmospheric drain with color and music. I piped in Dixieland blues throughout the public rooms and installed bright, contemporary lighting. The effects were fleeting. The sound system would randomly malfunction only in the music room, either fading the sound out very gradually, or just playing heavy static, but only for the duration of the track about loss or despair, seamlessly correcting itself for the next, cheerful song. The colored lights would simply blow out their filaments in a gentle pop a few hours after being installed, always focused on the primary spectrums of reds and blues. The house preferred the perpetual, oppressive gloom of half-lit shadows. The constant sense of being watched also began to evolve from a feeling to a true sensory input. I would sit at my desk late at night, doing the sparse bookkeeping, and my perception of the air would change. The air would feel so dense that I could almost imagine displacing a tangible medium next to me, like moving my hand through a viscous, heavy syrup. When I tried, my hand would go through thin air. But the sound was always there. The movement was always announced with the sound of heavy, old cotton being gently brushed against itself. A silken swish sh, as if the person standing next to me was dressed in a thick, long, hoop-skirted cotton antebellum dress. I didn't need to turn to know she was there. Usually slightly behind and to the left of me, quietly following my movement across a room, judging the adequacy of my current stewardship. I could stand in the middle of a massive reception room, frozen, breathing shallowly, and the gentle swish sh sound would stop and then slowly circulate about 1 foot from my head's proximity, utterly silent when it was the closest, and then start again as it moved away across the heavy wooden floor. The encounter that shattered my professional detachment happened in the main, beautiful, but rarely used sunrise salon. Every morning, I set the salon with iced jasmine tea and newspapers, standard Southern courtesy. I had done my job, arranged the table perfectly, and walked away. 15 minutes later, while I was tending my own small kettle fire in the tiny back kitchen, a devastating sound hit me. It was not loud. It was deep and emotionally shattering, the high-pitched, child's wail of absolute, inconsolable grief, coming straight from the dining area of the Sunrise Salon. It was the sound of a very small child in terminal agony and extreme suffering. It shattered all my prior defenses of scientific detachment. I ran to the room, expecting to find an intruder, a child. I charged in, pipe in hand, scanning the empty, sun-drenched room. The child's wailing stopped instantly. I was met only by the profound silence of a beautiful southern morning. But then I saw the table. The large, heavy porcelain bowl of creamed sugar I had placed on the table, the staple of the morning service, had been completely, cleanly inverted. It lay face down on the heavy, stiff, white damask tablecloth, which was utterly pristine, save for the large smear of raw, granulated white sugar scattered across it like a dusting of premature snow. The contents of the bowl were released, but the exterior china was perfectly still, not broken, just placed. Clara May's 3 children had died from a contagious fever associated with high sugar intake to combat the loss of energy. I looked at the inverted bowl of sugar and connected the wailing sound of the dying child with the deliberate inversion. This was not a playful ghost moving an object. This was a soul, trapped in the emotional pain of the manor, using a single symbolic event, the very substance that she associated with her children's passing, to evoke the sound of her deepest trauma, all in an attempt to displace me from the house by flooding the premises with utter, unbearable pain. The emotional terror was far worse than any active poltergeist activity. I could handle the cold. I could handle the soft touch and the swishing of the silks. I couldn't handle the agonizing, desperate sound of a child's last cry. Every fiber of our human instinct demands immediate intervention at the call of a distressed child, and she knew this psychological pressure point was the final one. After that incident, I put Willow Manor up for sale immediately. I packed the contents not with rage, but with profound exhaustion and a deep, empathetic sadness of my own. I could not stay in a house whose very history of sorrow was weaponized at me. The manor itself resisted my final departure. On the day I was completing the last walkthrough with my realtor, a nervous man who refused to tour the upper floors, Mrs. Willow delivered her final, devastating message of absolute, emotional territory that drove me out of the deep south forever. I was standing alone on the veranda overlooking the immense, silent bayou, locking my final travel pack with my personal documents in it. I heard the clear, deliberate swishing sound of the heavy dress move up to my immediate rear. I felt the sharp drop in ambient temperature on my left shoulder blade. And then, I heard the clearest vocalization of the entity, not as an imitation of a voice, nor a distortion, but as a pure emotional sound in the absolute immediate air behind my ear. It was one word, whispered with utter, profound, broken-hearted contempt, a sound only intended for my conscience. Outsider. The word wasn't angry. It was just a cold statement of emotional isolation. It cut through all my defenses. I was no professional. I was just another temporary, clumsy user of her home. 3 weeks later, I left Mississippi for good, selling the entire property at a massive loss to a corporate entity a month later, a blind trust without a principal owner. All I require now is the sterile, emotionally flat neutrality of a modern, windowless, high-efficiency apartment several states away. A place with no memory, no history, and no single emotional point of focus. My ultimate understanding, after my ordeal at the Willow Manor, is that not all hauntings are dangerous because of fear or physical violence. An American historical spirit like Clara May Willow is a perfect example of a haunting that uses pure, concentrated, historical grief as its weapon, overwhelming the intruder with a crushing, empathetic despair until they, too, are emotionally broken by the heavy memory of the soil and the silence. And silence, I learned, is not just the absence of sound, it's the profound, suffocating absence of all present context life, and that is exactly what the manor demanded of me. It wanted to be lonely, desperate, silent. It wanted isolation. And when I resisted the quiet, Mrs. Willow turned the sorrow of her children's death into the sound that finally evicted the temporary man. Story 8. My name is Noah. This final entry is about the slow, persistent siege and final, terrifying breach of my peace in a triplex unit in Portland, Oregon. Triplexes, stacked apartment blocks split into 3 units, are common relics in the older, greener parts of the city. We lived on the middle floor. An older, quiet lady controlled the lower unit, and the top space, the 3rd floor, the finished attic apartment, was perpetually vacant and terrifyingly active. My story isn't about a singular event, but the brutal, psychological degradation caused by the constant, controlled assault occurring directly from above. Imagine living with an unwanted resident who knows every rhythm of your life, is utterly determined to disrupt your rest, and who can move completely unseen at every midnight. This was the presence in the attic. The atmosphere started subtly, acoustic deception. The top unit was spacious and old, well-lit attic that had been drywalled and rented out. Supposedly, our landlord, an impersonal corporate maintenance group, assured us it was in perfect order, just between tenants. We never heard them moving in. But the noise began exactly 12 nights after we unpacked. The hour was always the same, 2:45 a.m. It was, at first, a light, almost rhythmic sound, like an acoustic curtain being pulled straight overhead, or a heavy, dusty satchel being dragged slowly across the old, exposed wooden rafters. SHHRR. It was high, dry static noise that immediately shattered the deep sleep I required. My girlfriend, Jenna, would simply roll over and tell me it was the old wood settling or the hot water pipes expanding. But those sounds were familiar and localized to the common walls. This was overhead, precise, and entirely concentrated in the dead center of the vaulted attic space. I called the complex's on-call number. Every time, the answering technician simply left a boilerplate message in my mailbox asserting that internal sensors show no activity within Upper Unit 3A. But the disturbance escalated on the 21st night. The noise migrated from subtle acoustic static to clear, definable footfalls in the dead center of the attic floor, almost precisely over my pillow. They weren't a careless resident's heavy steps. They were slow, deliberate, utterly silent movements that only culminated in a loud, decisive thud, the sound of what seemed like a sack of sand landing directly on the drywalled ceiling, followed by a single, perfectly audible, dry cough. The cough was the worst. It sounded like an elderly person clearing a throat full of thick, century-old dust, strained and sickly, a sound only possible when air moved across vocal cords, indicating a biological presence I shouldn't be facing. I snapped. I climbed onto my bed in a surge of adrenaline, grabbed the ceiling with my bare palm, and hammered on the dry ceiling tile directly above my head. Wham! Wham! Hey! We can hear you up there! Cut it out! We're trying to sleep! I roared, the anger momentarily overcoming the fear. The only reply was an immediate, dead silence that seemed to sink through the ceiling. I held my breath, waiting. A moment later, the deliberate, mocking footfalls began again, several feet away, now perfectly accompanying me to the other side of my own bedroom, matching my internal placement to let me know I'm not the dominant creature in this space. It wasn't a person making noise. It was a conscious provocation. The war lasted for 2 months. Jenna moved to the couch in the living room because the ceiling over the bed was becoming acoustically and morally impossible. I was trapped alone in the large, cold bedroom, and the presence, as I privately called it now, was getting closer, more personal. The focus shifted from simple steps and movements to manipulation of light. I kept a highly directional, high-powered inspection flashlight on my bedside table, aimed exactly at the smoke alarm mounted in the center of the drywall overhead. This was my personal defense. I would always confirm that the unit above me was unlit and still, with my own light aimed upward. On the 3 a.m. clock of a Tuesday, I opened my eyes in the darkness. My room was dead still. But what startled me was the shift of light entering the room. The presence in the attic was holding and using a powerful, focused beam of light of its own. A small, intensely directed, circular column of white light began to move slowly, almost lazily, across my floor. It wasn't filtering, it was being beamed. The source of the light was the single, small, circular vent hole for the old, unused AC register, located near the window. The light was highly directional, meaning it wasn't a static overhead fixture. It was a mobile source being held in place from above. I lay frozen, watching as the cold, white perfect circle of light moved from the foot of my bed, over my sneakers and fallen t-shirt, and then, slowly, traversed my lower abdomen, and moved up to trace the line of my throat, sitting a full 2 minutes on my head before finally extinguishing itself without a flicker in the vent's darkness. The sheer predatory audacity of the action was chilling. The creature was conducting a thermal, or perhaps simply a visual survey of my sleeping form, using its light source to confirm my defenseless position, waiting for the psychological moment of exposure. I didn't get out of bed that night. I didn't move a millimeter in fear the noise accompanying the movement would encourage some kind of escalation from the silent voyeur above. Following the light trap, the attacks became purely isolationist. They targeted the sound and the structural barrier between our world and theirs. The scraping noise on the wood floor evolved into loud, aggressive digging. For the last 5 nights before the climax, the sound was of something metallic, sharp, and purposeful being used to scrape, poke, and tear at the floorboards above my ceiling. It wasn't the sound of an exploration. It was the sound of a breach attempt. I could hear the gritty, dry cascade of displaced lath and plaster dust occasionally falling down the walls and into the empty space in the ceiling tiles. They were actively creating a hole to break the material barrier between our worlds. The smell, which had disappeared after the initial coldness subsided, returned with astonishing intensity. Not dead fish, but a hot, cloying odor of metallic decay and damp cloth, smelling profoundly like an embalmed body left in a wet basement for 2 weeks. It was thick and overwhelming, and I put a towel under my door, struggling to breathe deeply, convinced that the entity was tearing at some structural corpse hiding space in the attic a previous tenant had covered. The intense odor started at midnight and faded promptly at 4 a.m. every night. Then came the final, brutal crescendo on a Friday night, the single act of absolute psychological terror that drove me out of the triplex forever. I was huddled in my cold blanket, head buried under the pillow, the awful smell making breathing intensely difficult. The digging and scraping above me stopped abruptly at precisely 3:09 a.m. Nothing. A single, profound silence. Not an end to the action, but a focused interlude. Then, from the extreme right-hand corner of my bedroom, where a small pocket of plaster met a structural beam, came the single, most terrifying sound of the whole experience. It was forced breathing. Not a cough. Not a sigh. It was the sound of heavy lungs forcing the fetid, thick air of the decay smell through a restricted, damp cavity of some kind. A slow, agonized, wet "U-H-H-H-H-H-H" and then expelled "A-H-H-H-H", so intensely loud, so resonant, that it sounded as if a massive, powerful creature was pressing its entire face onto the plaster's surface, forcibly inhaling and exhaling, filling my space with the audible consequence of its toxic, lonely world. My flight mechanism kicked in. Pure animal instinct. I sprang out of bed and fled the room, charging into the living area where Jenna was asleep on the couch, shaking her awake violently. "Jenna! It's here! It's right in the wall!" I screamed. "Do you smell the decay? Do you hear that breathing? God help me, it's breathing!" Jenna sat up, rubbed her eyes groggily, smelling the lingering aroma of my herbal sleeping tea. She listened intently to the profound silence and the gentle hum of the living room refrigerator. She looked at me for a good 20 seconds, wide-eyed, then stood up and walked back toward the bedroom suite. "Noah, stop. There's nothing in that wall. There's no way." As she reached the door, she froze and looked back at me, tears in her eyes. "I can smell the dust. That's all. It's just old air." She didn't hear it. I realized, in that moment of profound truth, that her mind, healthy and rational, could not process the auditory and olfactory assault the presence had unleashed on me. I was the single auditory target. The fear was personal resonance. The sound, which had faded because I had stood up and charged out, began again. But this time, it was coming from the hallway outside my living room door. Not through the vent hole, not in the wall. The forced wet breathing was on this floor, on the other side of my closed door, separated from me by maybe 15 feet of wood-stripped flooring, heavier and slower than ever. It was the absolute, focused effort of something that had breached not the structure, but the psychological perimeter of my immediate and safest space. It had moved, utterly silent on the wooden staircase, from its high, dark perimeter to my doorway. Total, crushing defeat washed over me, displacing the fear in a cold surge of certainty. I was utterly, singularly possessed by the attention of a highly intelligent, predatory force that had used the cover of structural silence to conduct a 5-month siege on my security until it found the key to my escape. Full sensory perception isolation. We broke the apartment lease on the spot. We slept in a crowded, expensive, sterile corporate guest suite for the next 30 days while my brother found an ultra-modern, fully concrete unit, far too new to have an attic, and fully open plan, with no corners he could detect. I paid double what I previously paid to live on the third floor of a large rental complex where the air conditioning perpetually blasts a deafening chorus of white noise into the living space. I haven't gone back. The only final, terrible confirmation I learned came a month afterward when I drove by the triplex complex to retrieve the last of my essential mail. The upper unit, 3A, the attic suite, was once again being shown to prospective, lone tenants, by a uniformed manager speaking with an aggressive, cheerful corporate assurance. But as I drove slowly past, avoiding all eye contact with the realtor, I glanced hard at the windows of the former attic space. On the top center window, overlooking the street, secured perfectly to the outer pane of the dust-streaked glass, was a single object left behind. It was my toothbrush, one I thought was safely, clearly in my backpack. It was perfectly placed, angled downward, its bristles facing inward onto the silent room, as if watching the street in silent, knowing vigilance. It was proof that it touched my belongings, entered my space, and placed the personal item as its final signature on the siege before finding its next victim in the perfect, high-up solitude of the empty structural space. The presence in the attic is still there, waiting for the perfect male victim, a person seeking silence, a deep and unperturbed slumber, and a secure enclosure they can slowly and methodically tear apart from the perspective of an entirely isolated, invisible, and unattainable vantage point. The silence of deep sleep and the distance of a concrete floor are what it uses to conquer a man.